power coming from the ability to organize and, in this case, make canals and make the land productive. And that's something that we'll see later in Egyptian culture, the need for the king to make the land fertile and productive. And the connections between, say, Upper Egypt and Sumer during this time are quite extensive. This is tomb UJ. This is the tomb of King Scorpion from Abydos. And in it, we find a number of interesting items. You can see here, there are actually over 700 jars that were found as offerings or sort of use for the afterlife for King Scorpion. And these 700 jars actually had tags on them. And what we know is that they actually had wine. So he took 700 jars of wine with him to the afterlife. It's about 12,000 gallons of wine. And this wine is actually coming from the Levant. It's not being made locally, it's being imported. So he's a connoisseur of fine imported Levantine wine. Writing, of course, is a different system, right? We have Egyptian hieroglyphs being used, which emerge around the same time, and there's some debate between Egyptologists and Near Eastern archaeologists about which writing system emerged first and which influenced the other. Pretty much at the same time, we see hieroglyphs emerging in Egypt as well. So a writing system to keep track of commodities, and in this case, at Tomb UJ, the commodities were wine. In Egypt, at Buto, this northern site, we start seeing in the Uruk period evidence of an actual Uruk presence. Our clay cones, which we've come to see as an Uruk hallmark, show up. They're made out of local clay, so we know they're not imported. And you can see some examples here. And these ones were hollow in the top, and they probably would have been filled with a pigment, colored clay, and then used to decorate the facade of a temple or a building, just like we see in the Iana complex. These are a little tricky, though. They're weird because they're actually burnished on the outside. There's a lot of work that goes into making these things. So the question that is posed is, well, why, if you're going to stick this nail into a wall, why would you spend time decorating the outside of it? Why would you burnish it? So there's a line of thinking that these actually weren't used in the same way that they were in Mesopotamia. However, we do know that later in Egypt and Mesopotamia, we do have ceremonial pegs that are decorated on the outside, and they actually fulfill a ritual purpose. So found alongside the scorpion mace head in the site of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, we find this wonderful palette. It's a cosmetic palette, and it's known as the Narmer palette, dating to King Narmer, who was the first king to actually unify Upper and Lower Egypt. Prior to this period, the two were separate polities with separate kings, and actually it was sort of a city-by-city set of rulership. But Narmer unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, and we have this commemorative cosmetic palette where cosmetics would have been ground in this central circle. Now, again, this is very, very Egyptian. Those of you who have studied Egyptian art and archaeology will see the smiting scene, the crown. Everything looks very, very Egyptian. However, there are elements that we've seen before. What on this just screams Mesopotamian to you? What have we seen before that's on this palette? Maybe as early as last time in Susa, some of the iconography. Yeah.
The two animals kind of symmetrical right there, where it makes the circle kind of.
Right. Yeah. These really weird giraffe-looking lion things. They're called serpopods. That's the best word that we have for them, because again, they're mythical animals, but identical to that, those that we see in Susa in the preceding period. or just a little bit before. They're contemporary, and then also at Susa they show up just a little bit before these lion-headed sauropods with their intertwining necks. This is a very, very Mesopotamian motif that, again, we're seeing at Egypt in this very early period. It's interesting. There's quite a bit going on this tablet. In Egypt, we're seeing an iconography of warfare, of conquest, just like we're seeing the end figure, in scenes of battle, bringing the enemies of the city to their knees. You can see here a series of bodies that have been decapitated with their heads lying between their legs. This is actually kind of interesting. I'll just kind of point this out. These guys right here, the heads. I remember when this was first shown to me, there was an explanation that they were sort of wearing these interesting headdresses. The heads, you can see, have these horns on the tops of them, kind of coming off. There's another one, there's another one, there's another one. However, it was pointed out that this individual does not have those horns. And all of a sudden it became kind of blindingly clear that these weren't horns at all, because the bodies, what's also different about this body? Well, this body actually has a penis and is missing the horns, at which point you realize, oh, those aren't horns at all. These individuals have been both decapitated and castrated and had their penises put on top of their heads. This is from a kid's website, actually, which is a little bit, sort of disturbing. Anyway, I point this out to you not to gross you out or anything. It is morbidly interesting and weird. But again, just like the Uruk vase, where we have narrative taking place, and the artist, in a similar way of depicting the human form, is making very, very clear to you what these things are and what is taking place. All right. Anyway, moving on. A few things that we also see on the Narmer palette. Anybody know what this is? Anybody studied Egyptian art and archaeology? The first example of what's called a Serach sign. This is the name of the king, and it's done in a very specific stylized way. There's the images, right, that are phonetic complements for the name Narmer, King Narmer. And we see this all over in the early dynastic, and then also, actually it continues into as far as the New Kingdom. The Serach is this stylized way of presenting the name of the king. What you can see here is, right, these sort of edges, this niching. You can see where I'm going with this, right? Niched mud brick architecture. Another hallmark, right, of Mesopotamian, earlier Mesopotamian architecture, of course, is this niching. And in this period, we see the same thing happening in Egypt. There are objects also that are being traded to Egypt at this time. For example, at Minshat Abu Omar, there's an ivory box, which is probably a small replica of a temple that shows this kind of niching. And in Dynasty 1, and actually even earlier in the pre-dynastic period, we have examples of mud brick architecture that looks almost identical to the stuff that we're seeing in Uruk. Now, these aren't temples, these are tombs. So Egypt is actually using this in a very, very different way. But at the same time, right, the parallels are pretty strong. We see it in Dynasty 2. This is the tomb of Khasakhemoui. And later on, we actually see it all the way into Dynasty 3, at which point it tends to taper off, at least the niching does. But this is a very interesting complex. This is the funerary complex of King Djoser. And you can see smack in the middle, this is our first pyramid in Egypt. This is the step pyramid, which is built. I'm not going to say it's a ziggurat. I'm not going to say that this is a ziggurat that's later on, right, in Dynasty 4. That's when we see true pyramids. That's when our pyramids in Giza are actually built. All I'm going to say is that Egypt has a tremendous amount that it owes to the ancient Near East. And a lot of these attributes that we see that we think of Egyptian actually have their origins in this hybridizing period of cross-cultural contact with these major civilizations that in many ways are individual but also connected in a lot of ways. In the case of this funerary complex, actually, this is a fascinating, and we're not doing a course on Egypt, so I'm not going to go too much into depth, but this is one of the first translations of mud brick architecture into stone architecture. So instead of mud brick facades, now we actually have stone facades. Instead of bundles of papyrus being used to keep up roofs, now we have stone bundles of papyrus. It's wonderful that Egypt is also experimenting during this period with new forms of architecture, and this really just sets the ball rolling, especially with this great step pyramid that Zoser builds and later influences later pyramids too. This is very different, and I mean, this is a whole, Egypt, the king, this is called a Hebsed cord, and the king would come and run around it several times in rituals. It's very, very different, but at the same time, I just want to point out some of these connections to you. A few other items that show up. This is a knife handle from Jebel al-Arak, dates to around 3200 BCE. What jumps out at you? Tell me about this piece. Right, this is an Egyptian piece. What do you see in terms of iconography that we've seen before? Yeah.
Well, the symmetry of the two animals.
Yeah, right up at the very top. We've got our N figure again, right? And he's being flanked by two lions. This is the Master of the Animals motif, again on an item that is coming from Egypt. And these knife handles there's several of them. It's not exactly clear if they were locally made or if they were imported, but they are being used in Egypt during this time. And just phenomenal, phenomenal craftsmanship. You can see, again, our N with his beard, his rolled cap, both sides with the lions on either side. Boats, and it's beautiful, beautiful piece. Also on some of these other knife handles are imagery that is almost identical to that which we're seeing in Susa. We saw the serpopods before. Now we see these same symmetrical intertwining figures, in this case snakes with rosettes. Again, identical iconography found on these knife handles from Egypt, in addition to parades of animals, the same sorts of themes and motifs we've come to expect. Here's an easy one. This is a ceramic female figurine, Nakata 2. Very similar, right, to our earlier figurines from Tel Halaf and elsewhere. And finally, we'll wrap up with some of the tomb paintings at these Upper Egyptian sites. This is a painting from Tomb 100 in Hierakonpolis. And what do you see in this one? A lot of themes that are going to continue to dominate Egyptian iconography. Boats, for example, these river boats that would go north and south. Done in a very, very Egyptian style. If we looked at this, or early Egyptian style, we wouldn't think that this was